Hello everyone, and welcome to the first Flipped collab, or the first of one of two this time, for teaching literacy. My name's Rachel Couchy and I am your UC for this unit. As you would be aware, there's a very exciting pilot going on in this subject where you get to choose from a choice of 2 assessments, which is excellent. So you can choose something that you think is something that you would like to explore, or something that's a bit more up your alley in terms of what your interest is. So what I'm going to be looking at today is the evaluation of the unit and lessons, which is one of the options of A1a. If you're interested in the folio, I will make a separate video for that one, so you can access that one through there. I don't think it's a good idea to join them together because it'll be way too long. So keep an eye out for the folio if you're interested. You might even have a listen to both and see which ones take your fancy. So in this assessment, we are evaluating a series of lessons which have been provided to us. So let's have a look. So here's a bit of an overview that I've taken from the assessment details, and it just lets us know that this is assessment 1A, which is the evaluation of unit and lessons. It is worth 30% of our mark, and our word limit is 1,000 words, give or take 10%. It is due in week 6, which is still 5 weeks away, so plenty of time to really put lots of effort into it. It's due Monday the 10th of December. So basically what we're looking at is we're looking at the unit 1788, was life the same for everyone. It's a very easy unit to access. I'm going to go out of my presentation now and into the unit itself. So here it is. We've got 1788, life is the same for everyone. As you can see in the lesson sequence, that this is a year 4 unit, and it is a series of 12 lessons. So what you will need to do is select just one of the lessons to focus on. If you click here, you can see cross-curriculum priorities, which is also something important to this assessment, and general capabilities. So use those 2 tabs there. All right, let's get back into our presentation. So a very easy website to navigate yourself around. If you click on the each individual lesson, it brings you to the lesson overview and gives you the insight into the lesson. So what we need to do is, from that website, we need to evaluate the unit. So this is a lesson series of lessons that has been planned for us, and we need to use our literacy hats to think about the lesson in terms of pedagogical practices and in terms of what we know about literacy. And we might be thinking, oh, the unit just started. Draw upon what you've already done from understanding language and literacy and developing literacy. You've already got a good knowledge base, so back yourself in and say what you think of this lesson. From the learning materials we're going to have a look at so far from weeks 1 to 6, and the knowledge that you've already got from other units. Because remember, this is a 3rd stage unit, so we know that you've already got a good knowledge base behind you. So we're going to evaluate the unit and tell us what you think of it. We're thinking about the term evaluate. It means to, give us your opinion about what you think of the unit in terms of how it's going to teach the overall learning intentions of the unit, how well you think it's going to help students progress with their literacy, because at the end of the day, that's what we're all after. We want to be able to support children's literacy development and help them to move forward with their learning. So we're going to identify 3 pedagogical strategies used throughout the unit. I'll talk a little bit more detail about what that could be, and I'll give you some examples of some things that I've looked into. We're going to evaluate the use of the strategies to see if they were used effectively. We're going to discuss the effective strategies, or perhaps recommend alternative strategies, and support your evaluation with relevant literature. So we're going to also link this to multiliteracies, because that's something that's important to this unit. So here's a little brief overview on things that need to be included. It talks about the fact that we need to state clearly what we want, what the lesson is evaluating, which is in terms of the learning intention for that particular lesson. We're going to briefly discuss some of the strands that are covered. We're going to make connections to those cross-curriculum priorities that we talked about and general capabilities. And we're going to be comparing the AC that's used to something in a state or territory. I've already had questions on the discussion board saying, what kind of state and territory curriculum do you have to use? Well, that is pretty much up to you. When I did the task myself and I sat down and tried to put myself in your shoes, I used a Victorian curriculum just because I live in Victoria and it's what I know, having taught here for 20 years. But you don't have to choose Victorian. You could, I assume you're going to choose your own state because that will help you when you do finish your degree, that you've already become familiar with your own state's curriculum, but feel free to choose any state you're interested in. So let's get started into what the task is. Now, I went into the unit myself and put myself in your shoes, chose a lesson, broke it down and thought about what is exactly happening in each of the lessons. So this lesson is just an example of something that I've pulled apart, but it could be the same sort of steps that you could take to also complete this task. So I've chosen lesson 2 in the sequence, so the second of the lessons. So I have taken this, it's a direct screenshot from the lesson itself, and it talks about, well, the first thing I did was I had to think about what the learning intention was. So when I had a look at, the information at the beginning of the lesson, it talks about teaching kids about how informative texts are structured. So students would be exposed to the idea that informative texts are obviously much different to narrative stories in the format. So we're moving away from just having a look at stories themselves in that kind of orientation, complication, resolution, and you're moving on to saying, well, now these are informative texts. Obviously by grade 4 they've had a lot of exposure to that. So they should be moving on to being able to really specify things like glossary and contents page and diagrams and headings and subheadings and all of those kind of organizational features of informative text, and being able to explore what kinds of informative texts there are. So this is a learning intention for this particular lesson, which states it up the top. When you click onto the website itself, you'll see what the learning intention is stated when you click, and it says, to expose kids to informative text. So I'm going to keep that in my mind as I am evaluating, because for me, if the learning intention is stated as informative text, then that needs to be quite specific throughout the whole lesson. When I make my lessons and structure my own lessons and write my own units, I am very specific to what the learning intention is, because it has to be very clear for kids to be able to follow. And we should be doing tasks and things that are working towards that learning intention. And I'll talk more about that as we progress. So I just straight away thought, well, I can see pedagogical strategies popping out left, right and centre out of all of these tasks. So that's not too tricky to find. You can see straight away that I've looked for things like, I can see in activity 1 up here, in our first little box here, that we've got a shared reading. So it starts off all together as a whole group discussion, and the teacher models in a shared reading environment where we have this book, Avoid Being a Convict Sent to Australia. So the teacher's up the front talking to the class about this particular text. Then it goes on to, so that's one of the strategies I could talk about. And when I'm going to be evaluating my lesson, I can talk about how well the shared reading was done. And I could make a decision about, things that I thought were done well, things that maybe could be improved, and maybe what could be changed. I really like the idea of the before and during reading strategies. I think that's really good when lessons have that, because it helps to break it down into the things that the kids need to think about before they start reading, and things that the teacher's going to focus on whilst the reading is occurring. You'll see here that I've honed in on prediction and prior knowledge. So that's another pedagogical strategy that I could focus on. I'm just going to have a sip of water. Hold on, guys. It is morning and my voice is conking out. So you can see in here that it says, you know, what kind of book is this? What kind of features can you think of? There are things in there like the teacher's going to cover the title, so you're gonna cover over that and ask kids what kind of book they think it is. You're going to remove the title and ask them if they've changed their opinion. So all of these types of things where they're going to just flick through the book as an initial strategy and get some predictions down and try and establish what the prior knowledge is to do with this topic of being a convict in the First Fleet. As you can see, it links really nicely to the history, which we'll talk about when we get to the curriculum side of things. So I quite liked that part there where we're looking at prediction and prior knowledge. In the during reading section, it talks about things like making connections. So they're making connections between the visual in terms of images and words, and how there's a mixture of both of those things throughout the lesson itself. Students go on to looking together in a class RAN chart, and I thought, well, that's good because we're using some of those graphic organisers and we're using some visual thinking strategies to help the kids get their thinking down on paper. So that's another pedagogical strategy that you could look at within this one lesson. How well were these visual thinking strategies used? So it's a bit of a chart. If you click on it in lesson 2, you'll see that it's got like the thinkings before the lesson. And this would be something that they'd look at throughout the whole unit. It's not just particular to lesson 2. Things like misconceptions could be talked about. So it was a good springboard to sort of get that discussion going, but also being able to record thoughts. Because as we know, thinking happens in your head, and we need ways to get that written down on paper, not only for the kids to see what their thinking was and perhaps how their thinking's changed, but also for teacher assessment as well. And then we've got a link to multi-literacies at the end where the kids look at symbiotic systems used within the text. So from what I can establish, the text is quite a mixture of different modes used. So there are pictures and text and sort of a mixture of things happening on the page, and the kids have to be able to decipher that. And they sort of make a link to multi-literacies where kids sort of break down all of those different, what's audio features, what's gestural, what's visual, and they sort of categorize it together as a class. So as you can see within that one lesson, lots and lots of pedagogical strategies popping out. They don't need to necessarily be all English strategies. So you can see that shared reading, making connections, and prediction and prior knowledge are all specific to literacy, but visual thinking is not, but it's still a pedagogical strategy that's being used within the lesson. So try and think broadly as well as looking at those the strengths to literacy itself. So they're my ones that I pulled out of there. There's no right or wrong. You just have a look at your lesson and get 3 pedagogical strategies that you can share with us. So once you've got your pedagogical strategies, you have to think about how well have they been used within the lesson. And even though it's a lesson written by, I think it's from a department website, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be things that could be improved or changed. And, things with school and learning is that things are always changing. So best practice is constantly changing and things can be improved. And again, this was my own opinion, which I would then back up with supporting evidence, but things that I thought could be strengths of the lesson and weaknesses of the lesson are as follows. So I really liked the way in the beginning of the lesson there was a focus on prediction and establishing prior knowledge. So I liked the fact that they were having a look at the text before reading, and there was some sort of getting your knowledge ready happening within that stage, because it is quite a different book. You'll notice in lesson 2 that they talk about it being a hybrid text where some of it's sort of like in a narrative speak where people, like characters, talk about their experiences within the First Fleet. So kids will need to sort of get their knowledge ready and get their sort of mind thinking about what kind of text it could be, which I thought was a strength of the lesson. So I would talk about that in my overview, my evaluation, and then I would link to some sort of theory talking about why prediction and establishing prior knowledge is important. There's plenty in our e-text, there's plenty in other literacy texts that talk about the importance of establishing being able to predict when you read. So if I was going to use this in my essay, I would then link to some sort of theory backing me up on the importance of these things. I like the way it's broken down into before and during reading stages, as I mentioned. I liked the way it's used visual thinking strategies to make thinking concrete and discuss any misconceptions. And it gives you that springboard to be able to discuss ideas, which also is covering those history outcomes. And I said multiliteracies was used, and that's my strength for that. Once you've got your strengths down, you also need to have a think about what the weaknesses of the lesson is. So some of them sort of match up here, but some of them don't. So my thinking was that the actual text is not provided. I found it really hard to evaluate and use this lesson without any sort of pictures or snapshots of what the actual text looked like. So I couldn't get any visuals of the text. I Googled, and apart from having to buy the actual book or source it from a library, no images of the text were provided throughout the lesson, which made it really hard for me to sort of understand what they were talking about when they were saying, you know, talk about this, talk about that. I understand that if you're doing the lesson, the book's going to be there with you, but it would have been nice within the lesson plan to have some of those visuals. When I had a look at the lesson itself, there was a lot covered, in my opinion. There were a lot of outcomes, a lot of literacy outcomes and a couple of history outcomes covered, and in my mind I wouldn't have set up a lesson like that. I felt that in some parts it went off the track a little bit in terms of it trying to cover so much. The intention of the lesson was meant to be that they were learning about the structure of a formative text and how sometimes informative text can be that sort of hybrid text between a narrative and giving information, and there should have been a much more deeper focus on how that can be, how it can be that sometimes there is narrative speak from a character talking about the First Fleet and their experiences within the First Fleet, but it's not a narrative story, it's still giving informative information. I think there could have been a lot more discussion within the lesson talking about that, because that was meant to be the intention. The lesson goes off in parts for me because it starts to cover things like point of view, and it talks about using that Nanberry story, which they're using as a sort of a class reader over the unit, and talking about empathy and talking about, let me have a look at my notes. Talking about the fact that, they need to make connections to how the character was feeling. And I thought, well, you know, if personally I would remove that section and make it much more focused on what the learning intention was meant to be. My other issue with the lesson was that it stays as a whole class for the whole lesson. So the whole time the kids are together. They do the before reading strategies together, they do the RAND chart together, they do the semiotic systems together on the whiteboard. So there's at no point is there some sort of independent activity. So you could relate that to the fact that it's lacking in like a sense of gradual release of responsibility. So there is no gradual release of responsibility all the time they're staying together. There's no chance to go back and do something independently where you're working on a text to see if you can complete the learning intention, which was informative text and understanding how informative texts are structured. So students should have been going back to their tables to do something either in a guided group or independently to work on what the learning intention of the lesson was. Go to the Victorian Department website. There's a thing called Literacy Toolkit, and it talks about all of these steps that's really being pushed with the new literacy strategies coming out in Victoria, and the fact that you need to have this sort of mini lesson. So within the shared reading, there should have been some sort of mini lesson where the teacher models what they want the students to therefore do. So if the teacher's sitting down and saying, we're looking at this hybrid text, the expectation then should be that the kids are going to do that themselves. So I thought that that was a big weakness of the lesson. I don't think kids would have concentrated for all of those steps together as a grade. There should have been some sort of going off and working component, coming back and share. Perhaps maybe you could link to the fact that there was no reflection or some sort of comeback time after that because there was no independent task completed. I didn't like the multiliteracy worksheet, which is why I said multiliteracies are used on my strength side and that I didn't elaborate because I didn't think they were used well. Using an interactive whiteboard to talk about the systems and just listing them, I thought was not a good way to incorporate it because it's not meaningful. If you're talking about different structures of text, you could have really used, perhaps a video or something a little bit more engaging that then students could have gone off to work independently on. Now, I know I've talked a lot about lesson 2. You use this same procedure in evaluating any of the lessons. So I know I'm talking a lot about one particular lesson. I'm just doing that as an example. So you do the same process. Go into lesson 12, look for the pedagogical strategies, look for the strengths and the weaknesses, and talk about them within your evaluation using evidence to back you up. So if I'm going to make the claim that there should have been some sort of independent component to my lesson, I would then support the fact that independent reading is important with a focus. So that's what you've done for evaluating pedagogical strategies. Then I moved on to do this, which is the next part of our what needs to be completed, which is comparing curriculum, the Australian curriculum to the state curriculum. So we have on the right hand side here, what I did was I just purely cut and pasted from the lesson itself. So go into the lesson that you've chosen and I just cut and paste. You might have a better idea. I like to print it off because I'm old school. I just printed all of the content descriptors that came straight out of the lesson and I popped them on a page. I printed off the Victorian scope and sequence for literacy. You can use your own state's scope and sequence. I find the scope and sequence is really clear because it's just got the content descriptors right in front of you and they're all perfectly set up. And then I had them side by side. So then I could compare and contrast them. What was the same? What was different? How was any wording different? How were the actual curriculum structured? What was, what could I see? So straight away I could see that with the Victorian curriculum, for example, it does use the same strands of literacy, literature, and language, but it still keeps, we've been using reading, writing, and speaking and listening for the whole 20 years I've been teaching in Victoria. That has not changed for us. We still have those overarching reading, writing, speaking and listening, but they've incorporated, which the Australian curriculum does not have, so that's a difference, but we do have those strands woven into those overarching headings. I noticed that a lot of the actual content descriptors were quite similar. So the Australian curriculum talks about things like comprehension strategies, using purpose and audience and structure, visual language, framing and image, lots of different things like that, reading process, so increasing a range of different types of texts. There was pretty much, they weren't word for word the same, but in essence was the same as the Australian curriculum. So they've pretty much taken the content descriptions from the Australian curriculum and placed them within the Victorian curriculum, perhaps with what things they already had and has been added to that. So I just got my highlighter and I just tried to make comparisons there, which I then would talk about within my evaluation. I also needed to print off the history scope and sequence as well, because you're going to make connections to that as well as any like cross-curriculum priorities. I noticed within my lesson that there was connections to creative and critical thinking. General capabilities is just pretty much your literacy, so everybody's going to have that covered. I noticed that the history curriculum was quite different in terms that the Victorian curriculum was a bit more broader. They didn't talk so specifically about needing to talk about, there were stories of the first fleet mentioned, but then they talked about analysing people from the past. So it was quite much more broader than the Australian curriculum was, which would give teachers a bit more scope in choosing what kind of people from the past they want to have a look at. So it was actually quite an interesting exercise. So then in my essay, I would talk about what the things that were the same and things that were different about them. Some important elements of the rubric that we really want to make sure that people cover well. I like the fact that within the rubric itself, all of these main things are worth 30%. So nothing's more important than each other. They all have an equal weighting. So our first part of the rubric talks about the 3 pedagogical strategies and the fact that multiliteracies is going to be used. So you need to make sure that you've talked about that within your evaluation. So you pick 3 strategies out of the lesson and you evaluate them in the same way that we've talked about today. We're going to talk about how they're supporting children's literacy because, for example, if we want to talk about things like prediction, you would talk about how learning to predict and establish your prior knowledge is helping to develop kids' literacies further. If I'm saying that there was no independent component to my lesson, well, I talk about how having an independent component where a teacher is modelling explicit behaviour that they want modelled and then used by students, I would link to something that helps support that idea and how that helps students to become stronger readers. You need to draw on evidence, so you're using evidence from our unit and evidence more widely. And don't forget to use your content strands across curriculum priorities and make sure that they're all correct and that they make sense and that you're comparing. So you just want to make sure that you're comparing apples with apples. So if you're talking about comprehension strategies in one curriculum, you're comparing it to what it says about comprehension strategies in another curriculum. They'll match up pretty well. It won't be tricky to do that. You'll see when you have them side by side that the wording's quite similar for a lot of things anyway. Thanks very much for listening. I do just want to say before we finish off today that because all of these assessments are new, please don't let this be the only thing you listen to. I only got these assessments myself 2 weeks ago, so there might be other things that crop up that maybe we didn't think of at this moment. So this is just a starting point. Please don't use this as the only thing you listen to and then complete the essay. Please stay in touch. Please stay focused on the DB. Please come to the interactive collab, or if you're busy that night, listen to the recording. There might be more that crops up in terms of good information that we need to pass out to you. They are brand new, so there might be things that I haven't thought of yet. I'm going to keep looking at it in deeper detail. This is just a springboard for you to listen to, write down any questions and just get you thinking. So please stay in touch and keep thinking about stuff. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the interactive collab.